Today I want to introduce you to macroeconomics, big picture. Up until now, what have we done? We've looked at how individual markets operate, how the prices for individual products get established by those competitive forces of demand and supply. We've looked at how firms behave, so the theory of the firm, that real nitty-gritty stuff of what we call microeconomics. We now need to expand our horizons a little bit and look at the big picture. The big picture, of course, is macro for big. So let's imagine for a moment that in Australia that we've got our national economy and it's depicted as being our giant national factory. And you run this factory, and of course you're a profit-motivated business person. So what are you doing? Well, we've suggested continuously throughout the course that if you're a profit-motivated capitalist entrepreneur, you'll respond to consumer spending and in fact other forms of spending from areas that want to buy your product. So what we might find is you are responding to expenditure from the household sector, which we'll designate as big C for consumer expenditure. You might find that there's a demand for capital goods, and of course we've correctly defined that as investment expenditure, and that would be demand from the business sector. Now, if we just stop here, these two alone contribute probably about 75% of GDP or gross domestic product in Australia. So not surprisingly, this is the major impetus for economic activity, and of course it's why we call Australia predominantly a private enterprise economy, because we're responding to private sector expenditure. And of course we have acknowledged a lot that there's a role for the government to play in the purchasing of public goods, for example, to fill the void of infrastructure requirements, etc. Then of course overseas buyers want to buy goods and services from Australia, and of course we'll export those products to them. So the output, if you like, the output from our national factory, our national economy, can be depicted as being a combination of household spending, business sector spending, public sector spending, and foreign sector spending. Now we've got to be careful here. Don't forget that within our borders we'll generate income to pay for the factors of production required to generate this output, and we'll ourselves will spend some of that money on goods and services from overseas. So we actually have to take off from there the value of our import expenditure. Now, this is a bit simplistic, so I want a bit more room just to explain this to you a little bit more professionally. Okay, what I really want to get across to you here is there's a very strong interconnection between expenditure, production, and the creation of jobs and the generation of income. So what I want you to clearly understand is that in our essentially capitalist or free enterprise economy, we believe it's the spending of money that stimulates production. So if spending stimulates production, and that spending, as I suggested before, can be encapsulated by household spending, business sector spending on new capital equipment. Remember, investment is nothing to do with financial capital investment, right? It's everything to do with the acquisition of new productive capital equipment. C plus I plus public sector spending plus the what we call net exports. Now we give this little name here, and you've probably heard it over time. The value, the total value of production, we can measure with a little statistic we call GDP. P, gross total domestic within Australia product value of production. So textbook definition, the total market value of all final goods and services produced within Australia in a given time period, generally 1 year. Now, I want to alert something here to you. Textbook definition says total market value, and you might have had a little alarm bell go off in your brain, and the little alarm said, yeah, but hang on a sec, the market value of anything is its price, and prices can fluctuate. Therefore, this statistic can get distorted. Good thinking. What we'll come up with that figure, of course, is what we call nominal GDP, but we will learn to adjust that figure statistically to get what we call a real figure, because we want real indications of growth in economic activity. Spending stimulates production. Production requires, of course, land, labour and capital. We talked about that way back. So land, labour and capital, and of course, they need to be paid. The owners of those factors of production want to be paid. So wages and salaries to labour, rent, profits, dividends, royalties, interest repayments to the owners of the resources need to be paid, and income. So income, as I just said, can be many, many things, but of course income allows more spending to take place. So what have we got here? What we've got is this circular idea that spending stimulates production, production generates income, income gets respent. Now, make the connection. In particular, we need you guys to make the connection between levels of production, and therefore the levels of spending, and the level of employment. So we'll talk a bit later about what happens if the level of spending is insufficient to call forth a level of production that requires everybody who wants a job to have a job. Well, what we're going to do is we'll find out we've got what we call demand deficient unemployment, or properly called cyclical unemployment. But of course, what we want to get across here is there's this basic circular flow idea that what is spent gets produced, generates income, etc., etc. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, yes, but we don't get to spend all we earn. I say, no, that's true. But that, of course, is a source of what we call public sector revenue, and we'd like to think that that's going to come back into the flow via government purchases of public sector goods and services. You say, okay, well, I'm not going to spend all of my money, I'm going to save some. I say, well done. And of course that, along with many, many other hundreds of thousands of individual savers, that goes into a pool of what we call funds, if you like, in the financial sector, and it's the job of the businesses in the financial sector, which we know are predominantly banks, to actually mobilise that pool of funds into the hands of businesses that want to borrow to finance the acquisition of new capital equipment. Okay, one more, as we've said, we don't always spend all of our money on Australian produced goods and services. We spend some on import. So over here we've got leakages happening, but again we'd like to think that this one comes back via export earnings. So the leakages, which you might have thought were going to upset this notion of a circular flow, actually come back in the form of injections into our notion of circular, never-ending circle. Okay, now let me throw this one at you. Let's say, in order for full employment to occur, let's say that total spending per day had to be, say, $100 million. Well, what we're suggesting is, of course, that $100 million will generate a level of production equal to that, and that will create full employment and generate income, etc., etc. What if it's not? What if total spending between households, businesses, public sector and foreign sectors is insufficient? What if it's only 70, 80, 90 million dollars a day? What we're going to get, of course, is a insufficient level of employment to ensure that everyone who wants a job can have a job. So what I want to sow the seed here is that there are what we call ups and downs in the level of economic activity. And when you look at the stimulus to economic activity which comes from spending, you ask yourself the question, what are the chances that somehow C plus I plus G plus NX is somehow magically going to add up to a level of expenditure which will be demanding a level of production which ensures that full employment take place? Chances are remote. Next clip, I want to have a look at what we call the business cycle.